I really want to have a go at doing this. So, welcome to our workshop on no self-care. And just to let you know at the start that we're going to start with sharing some ideas and thoughts, and then we're going to go to a meditation, and then after that we're going to have pose some questions for you to reflect on, and that will lead us into a time of discussion. So that's kind of the format of what we envisage. So I'd just like to begin by introducing Joanna Macy. Those of you that haven't met Joanna, you've heard us quoting her already this morning. Can I just ask how many of you are familiar with her work, with Joanna Macy's work? Yeah. She's now 85 years old, Buddhist scholar, eco-activist, anti-nuclear activist, has developed a work which she calls the work that reconnects, working with people who are involved in activism of different kinds and those who would like to be, to help us get engaged, and those that are involved in activism just to kind of reconnect with the deeper sources of the work. Anyway, a wonderful lady, a wonderful teacher who's become a wonderful mentor to me and Radhule in recent years. We've been lucky enough to get to know her. Anyway, on one occasion we were sitting with Joanna, and we were telling her about the paper we talked about when we were here 2 years ago, which was a paper that we and others had written for the Journal of the American Medical Association, called, I think it was called Self-Care for Clinicians Working at the End of Life, or Self-Care for Physicians Working at the End of Life. And in that paper, we talked about the different models of self-care. And we focused on what we called awareness-based self-care, or self-awareness-based self-care. And, along with others who are now focusing on this model, like Ronald Epstein in Rochester and others. And was telling this to Joanna, and she was listening as I was telling her this about the paper, and was hoping to, that she'd be enthusiastic and endorsing, but she was kind of looking a little nonplussed as I was describing the idea of self-awareness-based self-care. And then she asked me the question, what does self-care look like when there's no self to take care of? And I thought, I hadn't thought of that. So that's really the sort of idea behind this workshop, and we're going to be exploring this idea and presenting our response to that question as we see it at the moment. So just really briefly to kind of review with you again the different occupational stress syndromes that we're all, I think, subject to either in ourselves or in our colleagues, those of us that work in the presence of suffering. Burnout, vicarious traumatization, also known as compassion fatigue, and moral distress syndrome. So let me just say a couple of words about each of these. That burnout really describes the physical and emotional exhaustion, the lack of sense of personal accomplishment, the dissociation that results from chronic stresses arising between us and our work environment. In that paper we wrote for JAMA, we were talking to an oncologist and quoting his experience, and he said, the stuff that burns me out is not all the loss and all the suffering I face, it's fighting with insurance companies. So that's the kind of stress over and over again that gives rise to burnout in particular. And then vicarious traumatization, or also known as compassion fatigue, but vicarious traumatization is a more accurate description of this particular syndrome. And this evolves specifically from the relationship between the caregiver and the patient. So this comes from that interpersonal interaction, the sort of interaction we were talking about in the previous presentation, where we're in the presence of another's suffering day after day after day, or hour after hour after hour. And that's why it's sometimes known as secondary traumatic stress disorder, because the idea is that when we're present to another in suffering in an open-hearted way, really offering our presence, the idea here is that while that presents this sort of wonderful, compassionate warmth to the other, it also presents an openness through which we can be wounded by the other's suffering. And so we can be vicariously traumatized. And so not surprisingly, the kind of signs and symptoms of vicarious traumatization, like increased arousal, re-experiencing the traumatic event, and avoidance, are very much the sort of signs and symptoms that you see with PTSD. And then thirdly, moral distress syndrome. This occurs, I'm sorry, I'm not keeping up with my slides here. Moral distress syndrome. This occurs when an individual identifies the ethically appropriate action, but is prevented from acting in accordance with the convictions by external constraints, and is often expected to act against their convictions. So, the picture on the left, a situation those of you working in hospital palliative care will be familiar with, called into the either the surgical intensive care or medical intensive care, somebody who's been on a ventilator for a long time, perhaps who's been pronounced brain dead, and yet who is continuing on life support, perhaps because of family's wishes to do so. And it may well sometimes, as it sometimes does, reach a point where everyone involved clinically agrees that the situation is medically futile, that there really is no prospect of recovery. And obviously the family acting on the patient's behalf is entitled to make the choice they make on their behalf, and that's a whole other issue for discussion. But the point I want to focus on here is the work of the nurse and the other clinicians having to care for that patient at a point where they may feel that their very acts of care are adding to a prolongation of that person's suffering rather than really helping them in some way. And that's been, moral distress syndrome has been described relatively recently, in the last 20 years or so in the nursing literature, but it's now recognized in all clinical disciplines that work at the bedside. Feelings of frustration, anger, anxiety, impotence, isolation, and I think importantly a sense of feeling devalued and marginalized by the process can easily lead to burnout for the reasons we've already said, and can also lead to attrition and clinicians leaving their department or indeed their profession. And when it repeats over time, it may leave a lingering sense of having been compromised, of being personally compromised by having to act against what one feels is the right thing to do in this situation. And this has been called moral residue, and it may erode a sense of self-worth. So those are the three syndromes of occupational stress. And the existing models of self-care that are out there could, and this is an oversimplification, obviously, but could perhaps be gathered into two groups, what we might call traditional models, which are essentially about having good boundaries in the workplace to protect oneself, like a kind of the white coat, the stethoscope, symbolically those identify the persona, and that kind of persona becomes a certain protection. But having good clinical boundaries and then having a good rest, relaxation, recuperation program when you leave the workplace. That's the traditional model of self-care. Self-awareness-based models of self-care are models that are based on our becoming increasingly mindful, are self-aware, so that we have the capacity in the clinical situation to self-monitor and to know when we need to step back, to know when we need to step in closer. Sometimes we kind of use a water metaphor when we're talking about stress at work, and we talk about feeling flooded or kind of that overwhelmed feeling or feeling like we're drowning. And so, just sticking for a moment with that water metaphor, the traditional model looks something like this. That we desperately hold our breath while we're underwater so that, when we leave work, we can come up for air, or when we're on break, we can come up for air. But it's really that sort of boundary breathe model. Whereas self-awareness-based model looks something like this, and it's the idea that with self-awareness, it sort of gives us this bubble that allows us to breathe even when we're underwater. And we sometimes use that image of breathing underwater. Maybe it's close to the psycho-spiritual container that Radhule was talking about earlier. So we might also recognize, though, that traditional models of self-care and self-awareness models of self-care both rely on the idea that there is a concrete self to take care of. Whereas no self-care draws on a different assumption. And we've already touched on that a little earlier. It draws on the assumption of anatta, not as no self, but as no permanent, solid, separate self. There is self, but it's self as process, self as relationship. So how do we care for a self as process, a self as relationship? And there's a paradox here that I just want to acknowledge as we move forward, and that is the seeing self as no self in the sense of anatta, seeing self as connectedness, as relationship, doesn't mean that we're not here as the distinctive individuals we are, because clearly we are. And so there's a paradox there. And we got to hold both aspects of that we are radically interdependent, yes, and that we are distinctive and have the capacity to choose. So this is the no self that we're talking about caring for, the non-permanent, non-solid, non-separate self. Sorry, let me just back up a little bit. Yet distinctive self. So we suggest there are three practices for no self-care. One of them is mindfulness and meta-awareness, the cultivation of mindfulness and meta-awareness. Second is cultivation of self-compassion. And the third is the cultivation of no self-awareness. And adding here that it is all in the spirit of bodhicitta. And this is a term I've learned from Radhule and from Mahayana Buddhism. Joanna, talking about bodhicitta, describes it as the overarching longing for the welfare of all beings. It's also described as the longing to become fully enlightened, to be of the greatest help to all beings. But that's the reason for it. And this is just a little, what I call a little bodhicitta prayer, which I use myself, which it's based on phrases from metta meditation, from loving kindness meditation, with a line of my own and also a line from Native American spirituality. May all beings be happy, may all beings be safe, may all beings everywhere be free, and may I become all that I need to become to best enable this to happen for all my relations. But this is why we're practicing self-care. This is why we're practicing no self-care. This is the underlying intention, is bodhicitta. So very quickly, the mindfulness and meta-awareness, I think everybody here is, I don't have to remind you, mindfulness is purposeful, non-judgmental attentiveness to our own experience, our thoughts, our feelings. But the meta-awareness, and this is something that is an innate cognitive capacity that we all have, that we'll all just naturally find ourselves at times in that kind of bird's view position within our own minds. But it's sometimes called introspection or meta-awareness, a cognitive capacity related to mindfulness that permits the clinician to simultaneously attend to and monitor the needs of the patient, what's happening in the work environment, but at the same time his or her own subjective experience, sometimes referred to as meta-awareness for that reason. So it's meta-awareness seems to is cultivated by the practice of mindfulness. It's not something that I don't think that we deliberately cultivate as far as I can see, but it is something that emerges and becomes more and more present in our experience and as a capacity that we can call on as we continue in our practice of mindfulness. Self-compassion, and Radhule's touched on this already, involves us becoming aware of how we tend to judge ourselves and criticize ourselves, particularly when things don't go the way we'd like them to go for our patients, and cultivating maitri, what's called maitri, or friendship towards ourselves, kindness towards ourselves. But self-compassion has another step to it, and Radhule led us into that step in her very brief meditation at the end of the last session. Self-compassion also means us being prepared to face, to be with, and to experience our own suffering. Compassion literally means suffering with. And so self-compassion means suffering with ourselves. So suffering our suffering, really allowing that step of abiding that Radhule talked about, really letting ourselves drop into our experience of suffering and allowing ourselves to experience that for the sake of all beings. No self-awareness, and this is what we really want to kind of look at for the rest of our session together, means cultivating an awareness and a felt sense of interconnectedness, where we experience energy and information flowing between us and others. And we know that we are part of rather than the center of what is. Mark Nepo, the poet Mark Nepo, has a line in one of his poems accepting this, where he says, it's a realizing that we're no longer gods who carve out rivers, but particles awakened in the stream. So there's a certain loss there of moving from the concrete, separate, solid self with its sense of autonomy and its sense of maybe omnipotence and false omnipotence or deluded omnipotence. But there's a certain sense of loss. We're no longer gods who carve out rivers, but we're particles awakened in the stream. And so we come into that deeper sense of belonging, and we don't sacrifice choice. We still have choice. So we still have the choice to set our intention. We still have the choice as to what we do and how we direct our energy. The practice of no self-awareness involves paying attention to another with full sensory awareness, respect, and in the spirit of bodhicitta. So the actual practice of self-awareness is sensory awareness, actually using our senses in connection with our own pain in the face of another, or perhaps in connection with other objects of focus, with respect, and all in the spirit of bodhicitta. And we'll say more about that in a little while. And I wanted to suggest that we could think of no self-awareness as heart work, as a form of heart work. And the poet Rainer Maria Rilke has a line in his poem, The Turning Point, where he says, "The work of the eyes is done. Now go and do the heart work. The work of the eyes is done. Now go and do the heart work." So just imagining the heart as a nexus of connectedness, invisible threads of light going from the heart to every being in the universe, most apparent to those that we're closest to and that we feel most connected with. But just imagining for a moment that the heart is this nexus of connectedness. So that if that were the case, then coming into the heart, in however we come into the heart, is coming into connection. And one way of coming into the heart is by honoring our pain. And this is the paradoxical tantric flip that Radhule was talking about earlier, and that Joanna Macy talks about. That the paradox, and Joanna, when she's talking about this, is talking about it in terms of our pain for the world, because she's very much a bodhisattva of compassion, and who's so concerned with the suffering of our world. And in her work that reconnects, there's a spiral, and there are 4 steps on the spiral. And the second step on the spiral is called honoring our pain. And the central move in honoring our pain is what we're talking about, becoming aware of, instead of turning away from it, turning towards it, facing it, and then leaning into it, and finally becoming one with it, and actually allowing ourselves to experience it. And she says, as we do that, as we allow ourselves to become aware of our pain for our world, our suffering for our world, and as we allow ourselves to suffer into our suffering and be in our suffering for our world, what we discover is that our suffering for our world is the flip side of the coin of our connectedness to our world. The very reason we're suffering is because of how connected we are. And so as we allow ourselves to more deeply experience our suffering, we come into a felt experience of that connectedness and that sense of belonging. And that's what she means by the tantric flip, that actually honoring our pain can bring us into this sense of deep connection. That a broken heart is an open heart, and that self-compassion is a portal to interconnectedness. Another way into the heart is by the practice of gratitude. To be with our felt sense of gratitude is to be in the heart. And I think this is important. This is not the idea of you should be thankful. There's no should here. This is again about experience. What do I feel grateful for? And allowing yourself to drop into that felt sense of gratitude. And as you come into that felt sense of gratitude and perhaps give expression to it, if that's what feels like the right thing to do, that also brings you into the heart. That also brings you into connectedness. And thirdly, we wanted to talk about what we call deep connection practices. Practices that we each know and that we each have, perhaps within our faith tradition, perhaps within our just in our spiritual journey, that we have discovered that bring us into that sense of connectedness. I know for some it comes very much through the body, through yoga, through different forms of body work. For some it comes through running, for many it comes by being in nature. For me personally, two deep connection practices that I've been working with and tapping into and drawing from for a number of years now are mindfulness of breathing, which I just, as time goes by, I just become more and more sort of grateful for, but also just in awe of, as to how such a simple practice is such an incredibly profound practice. And also deep nature connection, that for me is very much a portal. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Radhule, who's going to lead us in a mindfulness of breathing meditation, and then after that we're going to go into some reflective questions.
It's kind of challenging to do a meditation standing up. Okay. And again, let yourself settle into the sensations in your body. Notice the touch between your body, the chair, the cushion, the ground. And notice the sensations in your body, starting with the soles of your feet going upwards. Noticing the sensations in your legs and thighs. Contact between buttocks and chair. The back of your body. Noticing sensations and subtle movements in your belly. And chest. Arms and hands. And if there's tightness or constriction in your neck and shoulders, allow them to drop. Drop towards the ground. Allow your jaw to drop, to let go. Muscles of your face relax. Eyes soften. Space between your eyebrows opening up. And allow your whole body to be filled with presence, with spaciousness. Notice the space around you. And from this field of presence, notice breath, the natural breath, arising with the inhale, letting go with the exhale. Noticing the tactile sensation of breath expanding with the inhale, letting go with the exhale. Allowing your body to be breathed. For breath to breathe you. For being breathed by breath. And notice this breath in the area of your chest where your heart is. Brushing through ever so gently. And noticing especially the exhale. Exhale, brushing through, like wind brushing through the leaves of a tree. And allow yourself to connect with this breath, with this exhale, a sense of warmth and caring. As a felt sense rather than a thought. With each exhale, allowing the felt sense of warmth, of care. Brushing through ever so gently. And if there are thoughts, feelings, images, worries, concerns, comments, allow them to pass by like a leaf on a river going downstream, passing by without grabbing, without pushing away, fading away by themselves. always returning to your refuge, your touch point, the sensation of breath. Returning to the sensation of warmth, of care, brushing through your heart with the exhale. Breath expanding with the inhale, letting go with the exhale. Breath breathing you. And each time your mind wanders, which it does, gently and kindly return to the sense of exhale brushing through your heart with warmth and care. May the benefits of this meditation go out into the world and beyond.
What we'd like to invite you to do while staying in that space that we've just been led into is to reflect on some questions. If you've got some writing material, you might like to make some notes for yourself. If you don't, maybe you just like to think about them for a little bit. And these are questions to help each of us, each of you, to identify what your deep connection practices are. Practices that bring you into a felt sense of connection, a sense of being part of rather than in control of, a sense of belonging. So here are some of those questions. What makes me most awake, most alive, most connected? When and doing what am I most awake, most alive, most connected? What, doing what, and when do I come into a lightness of being and a peace of heart? What brings me into a felt sense of gratitude? What brings me into a sense of deep belonging? What awakens in me a longing to care for all beings, especially the most vulnerable? When, where, and doing what do I think, I'm glad to be doing this for my great-grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. So we're just going to take maybe a few minutes, maybe we'll get 5 minutes just to reflect on those questions, make some notes for yourself, and then we'll gather again together. So I hope you've had time. Radhule said you look like you've had time. We've got a little time together now. We've got 15 minutes or so, just a little under 15 minutes, and would love to hear anything from the exercise you've just done, or any thoughts you have, or any comments or any questions. So it's sort of open space.
Including the talk before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, did you want a microphone for people who have questions? So maybe you just put up your hand if you have something you'd like to share. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
Not a question, but just in response to the deep connection practices. For me, what makes me feel most awake, alive, and connected is being out in nature. Mm-hmm. And I had a delightful walk early this morning, and I did something I haven't done in a long time. And I had my camera with me, well, my phone. And I have the app Instagram. And I didn't know that it was a social media thing when my daughter said, "Oh, Mom, you should really start putting your pictures on Instagram." And so I just started to do that. And so I was able to take 3 pictures this morning. And before I knew it, I had people liking the pictures that I had taken. But 2 years ago, when I was here, I had done the same thing. And it's been such a delight for me to renew this particular practice, sort of a contemplative photography practice. And as I've listened to you, I recently was doing the 19th annotation, which is part of the Jesuitical tradition of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. And it's just another well, and just another way of connecting, and there's so many similarities, and it's just so beautiful, when we open our eyes to all the different ways of getting to that heart of compassion. So thank you. This is beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. What's your name? Sorry.
Oh, my name is Susan Andrews.
Thank you, Susan. Beautiful. Yeah, and just one comment, Susan, and thank you for that. And as I said, nature is very much that sort of portal for me as well. And in recent years, I've become familiar with the work of John Young. I don't know if has anybody here heard of John Young, Jonyyoung? And he teaches a lot about deep nature connection, and he teaches something called bird language, which is a way of actually understanding, not literally what birds are saying. Radhule teases me, learning chickadees. No, it's not learning chickadees, but it's a way through full sensory awareness around bird behavior of just coming into this incredible field of intelligence that's here, that's around us, but that we kind of tend to ignore, and how that can lead us back into kind of radical interconnection. And he just has a line that came to mind as you were sharing, where he says, as you know, when we connect with nature, nature connects with us. It's not just a one-way process.
I'm Lydia. Thank you for this. I'm very grateful. I've had recently a big loss in my life. My sister of age 75 died about 2 months ago. We lived close by each other on Cape Cod. And so I've been through all of that. She died of pancreatic cancer. I am a nurse. I was one of her caregivers. It was traumatic, very traumatic for a lot of reasons, but I won't go into that. What I wanted to say was what makes me most alive and connected these days is to visit the cemetery in Cape Cod, which is bounded with little shrubs. My father put this together, and there are many relatives in there. Her stone is there now with flowers, and when we buried her, I had a box made that had a horseshoe crab inlaid in it because it was one of her favorites. And so for me to go there with my dog, most days, a little dog who on the end of a leash gambles around, we walk through the area, we visit the stones, we visit the people, and I feel so connected to not only those who are gone, but then to those who are still present. And I have a tremendously, all of this, a sense of gratitude, a sense of being part of something, of belonging, of being peaceful. And then I can go out and perhaps I can be more loving, more open-hearted, and more able to give compassion to the world. So thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. That's beautiful. Thank you.
I think what brings me into my greatest felt sense of gratitude is remembering that I would not be here today if it were not for the medical profession. As much as I have distrust in the medical profession, as much as I think there's a lot wrong with our medical profession in terms of how we deal with the issues that we've been discussing this weekend so far. But I do have, because of that aortic heart valve, if it had not been replaced, I wouldn't be here. And so in the mornings when I walk every morning, I mean, I just take the time, and my practice is to do Tai Chi, and I do that by the lake and watch the sunrise, and I'm just so grateful every morning that I'm able to do that. And to be candid, I don't always remember because life gets in the way, and bills have to be paid, et cetera, et cetera. So out of all those this morning, that's the one that rings with me.
Thank you so much.
I find that I feel the most awake, alive, and interconnected with music. Whether I'm praying with a group of people and we're singing together, I like to sing, but not by myself. But when I sing with people on either side of me, I feel very connected. I also play viola, not very well, but I play it in a community orchestra. Again, I would not play it by myself, but when I'm part of something making beautiful music, when I play the last note, I usually get tears in my eyes to be part of something so beautiful. And the third thing is I work in a hospice, inpatient hospice, and when I get to walk out that door every day, I take a deep breath for my health and for being able to walk out of the hospice and be so alive and aware of that and grateful for that.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joni Webster. When I'm here and I do these exercises and the meditation, I'm at home. In the larger picture, I work with medical students, first year, second year, third year, and fourth year. And I introduced a curriculum I developed for the fourth year students prior to their becoming interns in mindfulness and stress management. And so the self-care and the practice of putting the hand on the heart is something that I have actually tried. I introduce Kristen Neff's work in self-compassion, and I work with, you have to be careful that the meditations are very small, short, secular, and the course is actually very popular. That said, if I have the suggestion that the students put their hands on their hearts I peek. So, if they have their eyes closed and it's a meditation, there's a place where Cindy Lee has a nice little short meditation. And she says, place your hands on your heart. And I precede the playing of the meditation with this request that they actually try it. If I have 20 students in a class, only 2 will do it. And so I'm also a physician in previous decades. What I want to address, or I would just mention anyway, is that I think there's a way in the medical training that systematically shuts down everything we're talking about here, right? And I think it happens very slowly, kind of like water on stone, without ever getting it called attention to. And furthermore, I think that what's offered instead is a sort of a seduction that if we change our innate bodhicitta, if we exchange it for cognitive capacity, that's how we know things. We don't need to go down to the heart anymore. If we have a trust in technology instead of relationship, then we don't have to feel the pain anymore. That we have the keys to this castle with the technology and the information in the brain means we're safe from having to feel stuff that hurts. And this is what needs to be developed and cultivated. And, my experience is the first year students could go for this.
Yeah.
By the time I see them in fourth year, and I work with all the different levels, by the time they're in fourth year, they're not going there because it would hurt too much. Yeah. And they think that the way to cope is to just close it off.
Thank you so much. That's so interesting. I wish we had more time. Mary's just come in the back and told us we had 1 minute or something. So what we're going to do is Radhule wants to say a quick response to that, and then I just had a couple of thoughts as well. So.
Yeah. So it's interesting, I started as a medical student in Germany in 1977 and finished in 1984. It's 6-7 years in Germany. And I got actually very sick after 2 years and had to take a break, which led me to Sri Lanka and to this monastery. But it was interesting. Then I had to have these 2 paths, 2 separate paths, because it was kind of unprofessional to be meditating and stuff like that. And it's interesting how actually meditation saved my life in medical school, I would say. And then when I came to the States, I decided to not get retrained, but to get my PhD in clinical psych. And even there, amongst analysts, it was like, again, out on the fringes, and now it seems to be growing together because mindfulness now is so-called evidence-based. We can see it on fMRIs, and we have research studies as if we needed that But I could tell you then, 1980, that it did something to my brain. But it's very interesting. But I think there is an opening now. And I was thinking of the heart, how now new studies shows that mirror neuron-like neurons are in the heart. And it's actually lots of them. And that putting your hand there really does something, but it's not quite yet evidence-based. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you. And what I would just wanted to add was that for 2 years I worked with Balfremont in Montreal, and we were doing exactly what you're describing you've done in trying to bring healing back into the medical curriculum. And recognizing exactly as you described that students came in knowing what healing is, but in the 4 years of medical school, that goes underground, and the curing part, with all you described, comes into the foreground. At the end of that time, we had to make a single recommendation to the curriculum committee of what to include to try. And so we thought, well, what can we suggest that would keep that flame alive, that kind of green shoot growing through the medical school? And what we came back with was journaling. That if the medical students all their way through medical school, and it was actually a visit from Dr. Rita Charon, who's here this weekend, who's giving a workshop elsewhere at the moment on parallel charting, that if the medical students can document their subjective inner life experiences as they go through medical school in their journal, have small groups where they can meet to talk about that, where it's safe to talk about that. It's like a Trojan horse in a way, that, kind of mixing metaphors, but it gets behind the lines, and it allows that green, it gives a space for that green shoot to continue growing. Because what's really taboo, in the culture of technology or technological medicine is the subjective life of the clinician, and it keeps that alive.
Actually, I just want to mention, I think the same is true for nurses, hospice workers, physical therapists, everybody. Social workers, chaplains.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all so much. Thank you for being part of this.